particularly how it is reshaping the way students demonstrate critical thinking in writing. Let me begin with a broader context. As we all know, the rapid adoption of GenAI tools like ChatGPT has significantly changed higher education, especially academic writing. And much of the current discourse focus on academic misconduct and how to detect large language model generated responses in writing. And in practice, this often leads to design, sometimes we call it LM proof assessment, for instance, exams with invigilators. However, I want to argue this risk-focused approach is too narrow. Instead, we need to shift towards a more sustainable educational goal, equipping our students with the skills to critically engage with GenAI in their writing when they're working with large language model. So the key question here is much more about not whether students use GenAI, because we know our students use GenAI, but how they use it and what thinking is visible in their writing and how we can use this visible evidence to address the concerns and challenges we have in EAP practice. If we look at existing literature, many studies have focused on large language model generated responses and human authored writing. And for quite a lot of study has suggested they are not very distinguishable, although we do listen to the plenary speech talk about the different features of GenAI generated text and human authored writing. But at the same time, quite a lot of the study shows students report using GenAI as a writing assistance rather than a writing replacement. So what is missing here is a focus on large language model assisted writing, because in reality, students rarely submit fully AI generated texts. They use GenAI in a hybrid way. So we know kind of very little about the quality of writing produced with GenAI and lead to insufficient evidence to help us as EAP practitioners to design programs to support our students to effectively working with large language model while still retaining their writing agency. Another gap related to critical thinking. There are very, very overwhelming and strong concern that GenAI may reduce students' critical thinking, and I may change may to will or have reduced the students' critical thinking, and they may encourage superficial learning. But importantly, most of these concerns actually are largely speculative. So it's based on perception, based on self-reports. There's almost no empirical analysis of how critical thinking actually appears in GenAI-assisted writing. So, but we know critical thinking is the most important skill to address the ineffective and unethical use of large language models. And we also have this debate discussed with our students. Large language models, broad domain training data, and their weak understanding of the context and nuances of particular subjects lead to hallucination and irrelevant responses in students' writing. So for our colleagues, EAP practitioners, this raises two key questions. How does GenAI shape writing practices? And what does this mean for EAP teaching? So these are the questions guided design of a much larger project funded by British Council. We completed last June. We look at the process of students use GenAI to help them with their subject writing. We collect the chat history, and we use semantic analysis to analyze it to see students' role, AI's role, student stances, and what critical thinking has facilitated them to become a much more critical user. We also collect products. So they are GenAI-assisted writing we use corpus analysis to analyze the language in this writing product. But in this presentation, I will focus on corpus analysis of lecture feedback on critical thinking. We also collect perception data, but due to time limitations, I'll only focus on corpus analysis of lecture feedback on critical thinking. I tried to answer two questions. One, what critical thinking skills have been well demonstrated in the ChatGPT-assisted writing? And what critical thinking skills need to be improved in ChatGPT-assisted writing? So before I move on to the data, I would like to briefly clarify how we understand critical thinking. We know critical thinking is a writing practice, is very central to academic literacy and subject writing as well. So in this study, we treat critical thinking as not as an abstract cognitive ability, but something we actually could observe in writing. So we operationalize this through corpus analysis of lecture feedback on writing products, and this product was the model was built in our early work to examine critical thinking in student-only writing. So because the data were collected in 2021, before ChatGPT born. And we adapt this critical thinking framework to analyze how it's slightly different or how it can be used to analyze large language model assisted writing. So the data include 990 lecture comments on 51 marked large language model assisted coursework for 14 modules across 4 postgraduate education programs. The lectures, they don't know whether it is large language model assisted writing or a student writing, but we invite students to send us their large language model assisted writing, of course, for research purpose only. We strictly follow the ethical rule, and they can feel really no pressure to send their large language model assisted writing. And that's how we get the data. So the comments were provided by 41 staff. The assessment or the assignment is about 2,000 to 6,000 words with varied genres such as portfolio assessment, essay-based assessment, or combined assessment like presentation followed by clarification or justification. The participants from various parts of the world, but most of them from China, which is very typical for education program in UK. So we analyzed about 20,000 words of feedback and tried to review the patterns in critical thinking manifested in large language model assisted writing using corpus analysis of lecture feedback. So these are the main findings. So as you can see, this slide shows the distribution of feedback across different critical thinking skills. And you can also see feedback is heavily concentrated on a kind of we call the lower level critical thinking, as you can see from the framework, which is explaining, evidencing, and establish relevance. And if we compare to the previous data about from students only writing without the GenAI, the comments about establishing relevance increase a lot. And I'll explain why later on. So based on this slide, we can see explaining evidence, establishing relevance account for the majority of lectures' comments and tell us these are the core expectation of EAP writing as well. Well, let's first look at the strengths. So the strengths are examined based on the positive feedback of teacher. For instance, you can see they may say, you define these terms clearly and provide appropriate explanations. We categorize them as a positive feedback. So these are the top 3 strengths of large language model assisted writing. 1, explain theory really clearly. 2, can use references to support arguments. 3, can provide a structured evaluation based on reflection. So these are the top 3 strengths. But the limitation is much more extensive, which I would say that I don't focus on the amount of positive, negative feedback too much, because as EAP practitioner and as subject tutor, we tend to provide some positive feedback to help students to motivate them, but we want our feedback to be kind of feed forward, so we provide more negative feedback. So I would like to comment, kind of focus on the focus of the negative feedback. So what are they? So these are the top limitations of critical thinking in large language model mediated writing. So one, insufficient explanation of local information. The second one is the evidence using insufficient evidence, outdated and unauthentic source. And one colleague commented, many of the sources you cite, especially those you cite often, do not appear to be real sources. The third top limitation is lack of relevance. So the missing link between the ideas and local context. You will see local come up quite a lot. The fourth one is about extrapolating. So use theories to apply to local context to address education problems is another top limitations commented by the tutors. Interestingly, and this has been discussed quite a lot, is the insufficient positionality, writer's voice in the ChatGPT assisted writing. We found in the corpus, we find lots of teachers try to emphasize you. It's about you. What's your own reviews? What is your own experience? So that is something we find really can stand out from the data. So if we compare the strengths and limitations in terms of the same critical thinking skill, we can see that seems to display kind of a very clear pattern. In terms of explaining, so the students did well, can explain the theory well, and explain their lesson design well if the assessment involves lesson design. But it is inadequate in explaining background context, explaining the application of theory to local practice and approaches and practical issues in local context. Regarding evidencing, which means to support arguments with evidence, either use personal experience or references. So references are used, but insufficient, outdated, and inauthentic references has been constantly commented, which may due to the insufficient evaluation of the references provided by the GenAI, and which is again very obviously we can observe from the perception data as well as the chat history as well. When we look at establishing relevance, it seems there is quite a good relevance between the literature and writing, but students seem to struggle in establishing relevance between the theories and practice or writing and context in terms of, again, the local student's background to establish the relevance between the reference and the context, the reference and application, establish the relevance between the discussion and lesson design, as well as the relevance between the teaching objectives and teaching solutions. So when it comes to a very specific focus, students seem to struggle to establish really clear relevance or sufficient relevance. And these were reinforced by the negative feedback on contextualization. So contextualization, the teacher commented on the relevance of context by explaining how the local context of the social culture natures inform, for instance, their suggestions inform their solutions. It's also reinforced by the negative feedback on applying, for instance, how to use their knowledge to address local problems. The students seems use kind of very a solution which can apply to all the various context without taking into consideration the local constraints. It also about the weak relevance can also be observed from the negative feedback on extrapolating, for instance, applying knowledge across different domains. When we look at the positionality, and which has been reiterated in teacher feedback, is their own voice. What do you think? We see a lot of teacher feedback in the corpus, which the teacher try to use block letters or block font, use capital letters of you, and then try to encourage students to express their own voice, their own kind of positionality when they try to solve the local problem or try to synthesize different literature and apply to the theory they want to use to inform their solutions. So based on these very kind of three really concise information or findings, I want to kind of discuss a few pedagogical implications for EAP practice. Firstly, we talk so much about we need to develop our students' critical GenAI literacy, and very importantly, it should be part of the academic literacy. I use what, how, and why. So what would be, we need to encourage our students to review AI output. Copy-paste is the worst way to do it. 2, so how to evaluate it, use cross-referencing other resources, or to consider the local context to think about appropriateness. And also we need to encourage our students to think about why, so justify their decisions to use or to reject AI output, and why, based on their own positionality, their own experience, and their own voice, to return their originality and criticality. Another implication for assessment would be we do need to reimagine our EAP writing assessment, and we also need to design the assessment to make critical thinking visible and accessible in GenAI-assisted writing. This would require us to design writing tasks that it will require contextualized application, not for all. We need to specify a specific group of learners. For instance, in education, they have a specific problems, how you solve this problem by taking into consideration the local constraints. In the task, we also need to require students to explicitly justify why this will be workable in that context. And most importantly, we would have a section to ask students to do reflections. In most of my module about the technology enhanced language learning, I always have a section. So I encourage my students to use GenAI, help them to design the lesson, and then to elicit feedback on that. And then there is a very important section called the reflection, writes about what are the strengths, what are the limitations, what did you learn from the feedback, and then why you didn't use some, but use others to improve their writing. So it's very important that we do need to provide a space in the assessment that students have their voice to be expressed. And one would be important, a very useful genre would be reflection. A very kind of small thing we can do to encourage critical thinking when student prepares writing would explicitly signalize the critical thinking terminologies in the assessment brief. For instance, we may say, explain your decision related to your context, related to the relevant references. So use this kind of critical thinking terminology explicitly in the assessment to call student attention to demonstrate those critical thinking skills. And based on my another paper to analyze how the assessment brief designed and presented affect the critical thinking in their writing product, it seems the more explicitly the critical thinking terminology used in the assessment brief, more critical thinking skills demonstrated in their GenAI-assisted writing. Feedback, we all know feedback is so important But now it makes feedback even more important to encourage them to demonstrate, to utilize, to develop their critical thinking. So in the feedback, lots of time we can use kind of questions to ask them, why is this appropriate here? How does this apply to your context? Sometimes question help to trigger their reflection and to trigger their deep learning as well. We need to kind of in the feedback invite them to have a deeper explanation to strengthen extrapolation, for instance, why this theory can be used in this context. Encourage them to have a stronger reasoning to discuss appropriateness for a local context and establish a clearer relevance to establish kind of the focus rather than to counteract the general purpose of the data feeded to the GenAI models. So I wrap this up now. Of course, we all know the increasing use of GenAI, the evolvement of GenAI will reframe EAP practice and other in higher education sectors as well. So now EAP practitioners, they are not only language educators, they are critical literacy educators as well. Critical literacy, again, is a part of academic literacy. And while now we try to think about language as part of the academic literacy, of course, it is a very important break to stick all these critical thinking together, critical literacy together to allow our students to demonstrate their knowledge and express their own voice. EAP practitioners will also be the designer of GenAI-assisted language pedagogy. And it is such an important area because we do need to equip our learners with the GenAI, critical GenAI literacy to use the language, to process the language and evaluate the language produced by the GenAI. They are also the facilitator of critical and ethical use GenAI interaction. And this might be another very important agenda in the speaking lessons about how you can use language in a way, talk to GenAI and to elicit the responses that will speak to their own stance, their own perspectives. So I guess the main message is now the issue is not whether students use GenAI, but whether they develop the critical thinking skills needed to use it much more effectively, responsibly, and ethically when they produce GenAI-assisted academic writing. Thank you very much. And I really invite everyone to discuss how is GenAI changing your teaching and what kind of critical thinking skill challenges are you seeing in your